Well, it was only a matter of time. In the end, it was Huw Edwards' wife that told us that he was the BBC presenter in question. He has resigned, and we're told now having mental health treatment. We'll debate and discuss all of that. Should we have known his name earlier? How does social media interact with mainstream media? We'll talk about NATO. The summit's over, but how does the UK now stand in the world? Are we diminished by all of this? And Liz Truss re-emerges with a plan for growth. Was she right all along? But first, let's get the news with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Well, breaking news. Huw Edwards has been named as the BBC presenter at the centre of the broadcaster's controversy. In a statement, his wife, Vicky Flynn, says, Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues. As is well documented, he has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. She continued saying, in the circumstances and given Huw's condition, I would like to ask that the privacy of my family and everyone else caught up in these upsetting events is respected. I know that Huw is deeply sorry that so many colleagues have been impacted by the recent media speculation. We hope this statement will bring an end to that. Well, it comes after the Metropolitan Police say that no criminal offence has been committed by Mr Edwards. The force say they have completed their assessment and are taking no further action. The Met has advised the BBC it can continue with its own internal investigation. It added that should evidence of criminality or safeguarding issues be identified at any point, matters are to be referred to the relevant police force. Well, the BBC has released its own statement following the Met Police response. The broadcaster said, we have seen the statement from the police confirming they have completed their assessment and are not taking further action. We're grateful to them for completing this work at speed. It continues. The police had previously asked us to pause our fact-finding investigations, and we will now move forward with that work, ensuring due process and a thorough assessment of the facts, whilst continuing to be mindful of our duty of care to all involved. A total of 4 claims have been made towards Mr Edwards. He is accused of paying a teenager for sexually explicit pictures and sending threatening messages to another. A third person alleges the presenter broke lockdown rules to meet them during the pandemic, with a fourth claiming he sent messages to them on Instagram. Mr Edwards remains suspended from the BBC whilst investigations continue. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now though, back to Nigel.
Well, pretty much everyone knew. They'd known since last Sunday. It had been discussed everywhere. Go and get your hair cut, and they would tell you who the BBC presenter was. And tonight, we learned just before 6 o'clock from Huw Edwards' wife, Vicky Flynn, who put out a statement, and she said, I'm making this statement on behalf of my husband, Huw Edwards, after what has been 5 extremely difficult days for our family. I'm doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. And I can imagine that for Huw Edwards' wife, for those children, for his elderly mother living in South Wales, all of this will be a complete nightmare, as indeed it will be for Huw Edwards itself. I'll declare an interest. I know Huw Edwards, I know his wife. We have something in common together through Dulwich College in South London, where his wife was a governor for many years, and indeed I went there, one of my sons went there, some of his kids went there too. I've always liked Huw Edwards. I've got huge respect for him. In many ways, as a broadcaster, he'd become the modern-day Dimbleby. You know, he was the man that commentated on the great state occasions, and no one could doubt how professional he was as a broadcaster. So what's really gone on here, and what are we allowed to say? I think the whole thing is very sad, actually. I think there is clearly somebody here who's been living a life that clearly wasn't quite consistent with the way that he really felt about the world. And that's about as far as I can go at this moment in time. And I think you'll all understand what I am saying. What's he done wrong? Well, I felt from the beginning I couldn't see any criminality, and that's now been confirmed by the Metropolitan Police. But the Sun newspaper had these stories, and they've run them for day after day after day, and this is effectively the end of Huw Edwards' career. He has not behaved well, and morally, you couldn't stand up and support what he'd done. But who of you out there have lived perfect lives? I reckon the answer would actually be very, very few. So is this a matter of public interest? Has the Sun newspaper done the right thing? Let me know your thoughts, farage@gbnews.com. I'm joined by Mark White, our Home and Security Editor. Mark, this had to happen in the end, didn't it?
Yes, I think it was inevitable that the name would come out. They've seized the initiative, at least through Huw Edwards' wife, and decided that it was time to name him. We were reporting, actually, the very significant development that the Metropolitan Police were not going to launch a criminal investigation when the news came through that indeed this was Huw Edwards, the suspended BBC presenter. There are 4 allegations, but with regard to the Metropolitan Police scoping exercise, a pre-investigation, if you like, that was the central allegation made in the Sun newspaper, splashed on Friday of last week, alleging that Huw Edwards had been in contact with a young person that at that time, according to this young person's mother, was 17 years old, that Huw Edwards had solicited indecent images from that individual and had paid large sums of money. Subsequently, that person, through their solicitor, said these allegations were rubbish. Well, the police have looked at the allegations and they have come to the conclusion that it has not crossed the threshold into criminality as far as they can see. So they've handed it back to the BBC to investigate that, whether, OK, no criminality occurred, but was there inappropriate behaviour? And they can now carry out an investigation into that allegation and the other 3 allegations that relate to 3 other individuals relating to contact that Huw Edwards had with them.
But these other 3 allegations, or call them what you will, are all discussions between consenting adults.
Well, yes, except the second allegation that was revealed by the BBC's own news division yesterday related to, and the BBC say they have seen it, messages, multiple messages sent by Huw Edwards to the individual of an abusive, threatening and expletive-laden nature in response to, it seems, a threat to out Huw Edwards online. Now, in the subsequent investigation, will the BBC rule that that was inappropriate behaviour or not? We don't know. They have got to carry out that. The other 2 allegations, one relates to an allegation that Huw Edwards broke COVID rules. Now, that was in the 3rd lockdown in February of 21, an allegation that he met an individual on a dating website, pressurised this individual for a meet, then went out of London to another county to meet this person, and that was, they say, a breach of COVID regulations at that time.
But again, not criminal.
Well, it would certainly carry, if there is evidence, so, for instance, electronic evidence that confirms that that meeting did take place on those dates, then there could be a fixed penalty notice. We've seen, obviously, with Boris Johnson and others,
and
retrospectively, there have been these fixed penalty notices.
And the 4th allegation is creepy Instagram messages, love hearts and kisses. I think we can just discount that, can't we?
I think we need to take a step back, though. Nigel, there is absolutely understandable concern for the health of Huw Edwards, a man who, it has been reported fairly widely in the past, has suffered from severe depression, who clearly, faced with these allegations, has taken a very bad turn. His wife now confirming that he is in hospital for the foreseeable future being treated. And although the police are saying there is no criminal investigation here, it doesn't mean that at the end of the day, now that the BBC are free to investigate this, that there is not a pattern of behaviour that they deem to be inappropriate. We just don't know.
No. I'd be very surprised, Mark, if they don't.
And I think just one more thing to add, because now that name of Huw Edwards is out there in public, it might bring other people forward.
It may well. Mark White, thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm joined by Joshua Rosenberg, KC solicitor and former BBC legal correspondent. Privacy. Privacy, it's a word that we've been debating a lot, not just this week, but actually pre and post Leveson, which changed the law in this country. We have Article 8, of course, you know, of the human rights legislation, the right to privacy, and a lot of that depends on how judges interpret it. To what extent is this list of charges that the Sun newspaper have brought, to what extent do you believe these are matters of public interest?
That's what the Sun had to balance when it decided not to name Huw Edwards, because you referred to Article 8, right to respect for a person's private and family life. Article 10 of the Human Rights Convention protects freedom of expression. What the courts have always had to do is balance those two rights. Not an easy thing. It all depends on the circumstances. The Sun's lawyers advised it last week that privacy outweighed the public interest in naming Huw Edwards. Well, that was their decision. It may well have been, and we don't know because the Sun hasn't told us, that they were concerned that if they named him, this would have a very serious effect on his mental health because, as you've been reporting now, everybody knows he suffered from depression.
Yeah.
And so we don't know why the Sun didn't name him. Yes, it respected his privacy, but it might have been concerned that it would have a serious effect on him. It has had a serious effect on him. It says that his wife says that the events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He suffered another serious episode and is receiving inpatient hospital care where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. That's a very serious aspect.
Yes, it is, but there is also something called personal responsibility for your own behaviour, isn't there?
Certainly there is. And that's what the Sun's lawyers will have weighed up in deciding whether to run the story and whether to name him. And that's what they didn't do last week.
Bizarre world we're living in, Joshua, isn't it, where newspapers and broadcasters can't name the individual, and yet on Twitter and many other social media platforms, everyone's known who it is and photographs have been shown. How do we balance the two of these things?
The courts are practical. There are times when they have granted injunctions, even though an awful lot of people have known who an individual is who has obtained an injunction, on the basis that there are still plenty who don't know who the individual is. But if the thing is in the public domain, they will not grant an injunction. They will not expect people to keep something private that's obvious. Obviously, the concerns about privacy disappeared at 6 o'clock tonight. Immediately, Huw Edwards' wife named him. Nobody who's a lawyer would suggest otherwise. Once it's in the public domain, it's in the public domain. But until then, he had a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Do you believe the Sun have done the right thing in revealing this story?
Well, they have to answer to Huw Edwards' wife, Vicky Flynn, who, as we've been saying, has said that the publication of the story damaged his mental health. Now, if the BBC had reported to him the allegations some months earlier, 2 months ago, when these allegations were apparently first reported to the BBC, and handled it differently, who knows how it would have happened. I think the shock of seeing it in the newspaper would be much greater than the shock to his health of being told by his employer, hang on, there have been complaints, there have been suggestions. I think the Sun's entitled to say, well, why didn't the BBC handle it better originally?
Which they have been saying.
Yes.
Very loudly and clearly. Yeah. I'm joined by Neil Wallace, former newspaper editor, and, of course, an old Sun veteran in the old days as well. It interests me, Neil, I was discussing with Joshua the question of privacy and what the press can and can't say. Leveson became law just over a decade ago. I suspect that pre-Leveson, the Sun would have published his name to begin with.
I suspect it may well have done. And although Leveson isn't actually law, it had the effect of becoming law.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's become more and more draconian, and what we've seen is a continuing wave of judge-created privacy law. Very little of our privacy laws are actually have been made in Parliament. Most of them have been created by a succession of judges who have gone along with demands for ever greater privacy.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the charge sheet, if we can call it that, the 4 separate allegations that have been published in the Sun newspaper, the Met have judged that there are no criminal proceedings to take. One could argue, yes, he's a public figure of great responsibility. You know, the man that commentates on the Queen's funeral, the new Dimbleby.
Quite.
In our national life. Do we have a right to know, is it a matter of public interest that he happens to chase young people on the internet?
I think that what is very clear from this is that this has been a long time coming.
Yeah.
There's been a huge pressure in Huw Edwards' life that I suspect long precedes this. There is a confusion in his need for sexual contact between how he's living and what he craves. And I don't think that's a minor issue. And I think that that has influenced to some, the consideration of that has influenced the Sun's coverage. Because this has been a long time coming. I was checking the cuttings earlier. The first sort of a link of him with a young person relates back to early 2018. There are 4 different incidents now being published and recorded, and they are of a very similar situation. It is about internet contact. It is about requesting photos. It is about requesting meetings.
Which, by the way, millions of people do.
Quite. But the difference is that before the family first complained to the BBC in June, 10 days before that, he was the key anchor at the King's coronation. This is one of the biggest names in British television.
Yes.
This is one of the most powerful. This is one of the most well-off. And another trait of this was that he was basically giving money constantly to young people. And we've got to remember how this story came out.
Not illegal.
Not illegal, but it doesn't mean to say it was right or acceptable. So this came out because 2 caring parents and...
So the Sun are our moral guardians, are they?
Well, on this one, they appear to have negotiated a very difficult road.
Do you believe the Sun have done the right thing here? Because some will say a tabloid newspaper has destroyed a man's life.
Well, I suspect that the truth of that is what it's always been for as long as I've been around, which is that this man's actions have led him to this place. Now, I think there's a huge number of questions here. Is this a complete surprise to everybody in his private life? Is this a complete surprise to the BBC? Now, I've just been looking at this. He has known about the press interest now. This pressure has been on him for 8 days. Now, that's a lot of pressure. Wow. Maybe if at the beginning the BBC had taken this seriously and pursued it properly back in June, maybe they could have sort of, if you like, helped him through this. But as it is, a tsunami, don't forget, it isn't just the Sun who's run this story. Every single newspaper, Guardian included, has been page one-ing this. Last night, the BBC itself
broke
one of these stories.
It was odd because the BBC was investigating the BBC. A final thought, Joshua, as a former BBC man, it's our national broadcaster. We're all taxed 159 quid a year, effectively, to watch it. It did look a little bit like, with Tim Davie yesterday, that they've been asleep at the wheel with some very serious allegations.
I think he accepted that the way that the original investigation was handled was not optimum. He said there would be an inquiry into processes. The fact that it wasn't red flagged, to use his phrase, the fact that there was only 1 email and 1 phone call is something he's quite vulnerable on.
Yeah. Gentlemen, both of you, thank you very much indeed. And it's a big story. It's a dramatic story, but there's no gloating. It's a very, very sad story for Huw Edwards and for all of his family. The NATO summit finished yesterday. Is it any wonder that Joe Biden doesn't want a Brit to become the next boss of NATO? Have we demilitarised over the last 13 years to the level that nobody on the world stage can now take us seriously? Well, that NATO summit is over. It seemed actually there was a huge level of disagreement, but of course the usual grand statements put out afterwards. But some real questions being raised. I'm joined by Mark Francois, Conservative Member of Parliament for Rayleigh and Wickford and Chairman, of course, of the European Research Group, which may be relevant to this debate in many, many ways. First things first, I cannot understand for the life of me, Mark Francois, why it's always the Brits that are pushing for expansion to the east of NATO, and when we were members, the European Union as well. Surely, us putting out a signal that Ukraine should join NATO is just poking a provocative stick at a cornered rat called Putin. Makes no strategic sense in the short term whatsoever.
Well, look, Ben Wallace, I think, based on the intelligence that he saw as Defence Secretary, saw it coming. And Ben fought the blob, he fought the Whitehall establishment to get those javelins, those NLAWs, built in Belfast, by the way, to the Ukrainians in time for them to train on them. And I think it is true to say, with what we now know about those first 48 hours of the invasion, that if Ben Wallace hadn't gone out on a limb to give those weapons to the Ukrainians and make sure they knew how to use them, the Russians would have got to Kyiv.
But that's a different debate, right? Arming Ukraine, helping Ukraine, is a different thing to saying, come and join our club, come and join NATO. Because the one thing we know about the Russians historically is paranoia is very deep. And frankly, after Napoleon, Hitler and all the rest of it, we can perhaps understand why. I mean, all we've done, Mark, my argument is this.
Go on.
And I've argued this now for 30 years. All we do by encroaching eastwards is to give Putin, or whoever leads Russia, a message to his own people, they're coming after us again. Does it make sense?
Well, we're blunt speakers, so let me speak frankly. You know, Vladimir Putin is an ex-KGB colonel. You know, we're not talking about a Girl Guide here, right? And if you look at his speeches, going back over a number of years, he once described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So that's the mental space he's in. And he is, some people would argue, in all of his actions in Georgia and in the Crimea and elsewhere, he's been attempting to create the Soviet Empire as a kind of form of Greater Russia. And if you accept that paradigm, everything he has done is consistent with that. When people say he's a madman, he's not. He's not clinically insane. He just has a totally different value system
but he is
to you and
dangerous.
I. Absolutely. So he is. But history shows, Nigel, you stand up to bullies, you don't appease them. So appeasing Putin would be the worst thing.
Oh, no, I wouldn't want to appease him.
No, I never said you did.
But I'm arguing,
Yeah.
I think the expansion's been provocative. Moving on. Ben Wallace, who you lauded a couple of minutes ago, and clearly a very good chap. You know, ex-army man, very committed to the role, perfect in many ways.
Longest ever serving Tory defence secretary.
Yeah, no, I mean,
as it happens.
which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Been vetoed by Biden. And Biden now favours, can you believe it, Ursula von der Leyen, the boss of the European Commission, and universally acclaimed as being the worst defence minister that Germany ever had. She ran down defence spending under her tenure in Germany down to 1.1% of GDP. What game is Biden playing?
Well, look, we have readiness issues of our own, but the German case is probably even worse. One of the reasons our readiness is not what it should be is because, frankly, we've given so much kit to the Ukrainians. If you wanted to take the analogy that
We've got no artillery shells left. We've given them all to Ukraine.
Well, not all of them. We just ordered some
nearly
more.
all.
But if I can make an analogy that some people are using, which I think your viewers will follow, we've been like an organ donor that's given away some of its most vital organs militarily to the Ukrainians, who've put them to good use. But we need to grow those organs back. Now, I also serve on the House of Commons Defence Committee. We were on a visit to Army headquarters at Andover for most of the day. I've come back basically hot foot to do this. I hope I'm not being prissy. Some of that I can't talk about live on air. But the point is, the Army now have an accelerated programme, if you like, to grow back those organs, to continue the analogy, to make up for the ones that we have given to the Ukrainians. And relative to the size of our army, we have given more to the Ukrainians than any other NATO nation, including, for the record, the United States.
I get that. But let me tell you something, Mark. You know, I'm well connected in North America, as you know.
We do. You have certain people on speed dial that I don't. Trying
to be serious here. There are a lot of senior American military figures, political figures and media figures, and not all of them like us, and we know that. But amongst those that like us, who are deeply concerned that 13 years of Conservative government has seen us running down the size and capability of our armed forces to a level where we're not being taken seriously anymore.
Well, look, we're committed to increase defence spending to 2.5%.
The Army is 73,000. It's the smallest it's been since the days of Queen Anne.
The Army is 76,000, but
going down to 73.
Yeah, well, Nigel, there are 2 points. I believe, I mean, you know me, I believe we should spend more on defence, right? I've been consistent about that.
I know you do.
Yeah, but I would also argue, before we spend more money, we should spend more effectively the money that we already spend. And our committee have been looking at this in real depth for a number of months, and we've got a report coming out fairly soon about that. The first thing to do is to spend the money much more effectively. Look at programmes like Ajax, for instance. So the first thing is to spend the money we've got more effectively, and then on the back of that, then hopefully get more money and spend that more effectively too. So it's not just about the total amount that you spend. It's about how you spend it.
And it isn't with health or anything else. It's how you spend it.
But sorry, for the avoidance of doubt, first, my father was a D-Day veteran, as you know.
Yeah.
First duty of government, above all others, is the defence of the realm.
I know.
And any Conservative should have that as part of their DNA, right?
Well, Francois, I don't disagree with a single word of that, which is why I'm so disappointed by what a Conservative government has done over the course of the last 13 years. Mark, keep us up to date on what's going on. I would just end this segment by saying this. You'll hear people talking about high-tech, about drones and everything else. What the wars in Ukraine, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq teach us is you still need boots on the ground, and good boots at that. In a moment, our own Liam Halligan has been with former Prime Minister Liz Truss today. She's broken cover with her plan for growth. We'll find out all about it in just a couple of minutes. Well, our much maligned former Prime Minister Liz Truss really did break cover today with the launch of her Growth Commission. Let's have a little look at one or two of the things she had to say.
What we've seen for decades is low economic growth, and what that means is people are worse off than they need to be. Today's report shows that they are £10,000 worth off in terms of spending power than people in the United States. And it's, of course, vital that families are able to keep more of their own money, they're able to earn more money to help deal with the inevitable difficulties in life, whether it's inflation, whether it's needing to buy a new car. Having that extra growth is vitally important. So what this commission is looking at is what are the policies needed to get.
Well, that was Liz Truss talking to GB News' own economics editor, Liam Halligan. And Liam actually chaired the whole event today with a rather stellar panel, and he joins me now. This, Liam, this morning was a coming together, I think, of what we call Tory free marketeers.
That's right. Liz Truss has been much maligned. Her mini-budget with Kwasi Kwarteng last September, as you'll remember, led to a big spike in borrowing costs, what we call gilt yields, what the government has to pay investors to lend the government money last September in response to her efforts to not raise taxes, to maybe spend a little bit less, and so on. But the reality is, Nigel, even though we've had sensible people in charge since then...
The grown-ups.
The grown-ups, Rishi Sunak,
yes.
Jeremy Hunt...
Yes, and where are interest rates now?
Government borrowing costs are now significantly higher than they were at the height of the Truss-Kwarteng mini-budget panic. And I think that reality has given her a little bit of licence, a little bit of permission to speak out again. And she has convened this group of a dozen or so economists from across the world, not just Brits, but Americans, Indian economists, Japanese economists. I've met most of them in my travels, and I met a lot of them today because I chaired the press conference today. I'm not a member of the commission as a journalist, but I did chair the press conference today. And I think in some senses, she's got points to make. And there were other former cabinet ministers there, Lord Frost, Priti Patel, Ranil Jayawardena. And Ranil Jayawardena really seems to be Liz Truss's consigliere, if you like, in Parliament. And he told me he's got a group of 50 or 60 Tory backbenchers who agree with what Liz Truss is saying. Let's have low tax, let's have pro-enterprise, supply-side policies, let's try and grow the pie rather than argue about the size of the pie as it currently is.
You see, it's quite funny you say those things because, I would have thought myself for the last 40 years, naturally, these were things that a so-called Conservative Party would believe in, would put in manifestos, would attempt to implement in government. And it looks to me, it seems to me, maybe I'm being unfair, we've had 13 years of the state getting bigger, taxes going up, the self-employed, the sole traders feeling they're being crushed, the corporates taking control. Is Liz Truss's group going to change anything?
The tax take is at a 70-year high, Nigel, tax as a share of GDP. And a lot of Conservatives you speak to, they seem to think that the answer to all problems that the state may have is to borrow and spend more money.
More state.
Yeah, that is just unsustainable. The government is now spending more to borrow than Greece, than Italy. I mean, it's an inflation issue rather than what we call a credit issue. People don't think the Bank of England can't, underpin the British economy. They don't think the British state is going to go bankrupt, but they see we've got high inflation. Inflation, which I actually think will come down quite soon, but that's another discussion. But she is trying to bolster that kind of centre-right of the traditional Tories, which has been sorely lacking.
There's little prospect of Jeremy Hunt or Rishi Sunak listening. Is a final thought on this. Was today the beginning of a campaign to turn the Conservative Party around in opposition?
Well, certainly Rishi Sunak won't have been happy that this happened, a kind of circus on the edge of Westminster. Clearly, the Growth Commission will be at the Conservative Party conference this October. Clearly, it's going to be banging the drum. There are too many serious people involved among those commissioners for this to be a damp squib. There are too many big economic names involved that are now likely to become household names.
Liam Halligan, as ever, thank you. Now, RAF Wethersfield, the old site there up in the district of Braintree. Of course, we know the local residents, Braintree Council, have been going for a judicial review. Isn't it amazing? The government have chosen not to wait for the outcome of that legal process, and today 46 cross-channel migrants were moved into that former RAF base. How extraordinary that when the law says you can't deport people, we obey, but when it comes to filling up former RAF bases, the government can ignore the law. What is not being reported is that 24 families, service families, have been removed from the base to make room for what is going to be a very large number of cross-channel migrants moving in. And I think we talk so often about the £6 or £7 million a day cost of housing migrants and all the rest of it. I don't think we talk enough about the human effect on people who lose their jobs and people who get moved and lose their homes. And joining me now is a resident who doesn't want to be named, who's been moved out of Wethersfield. And if I can ask you, please, first up, you know, how did you feel to be told you simply had to move?
I think it's never easy moving house. Over the last year, quite a few people have been moved off the site. Some have got young children.
Yeah, I mean, so what is the effect on the community? Have you all been broken up and sent to different parts of Essex? You know, what's actually happened to you?
If you're talking about community impact, I think the local community is more what you need to speak about. You know, people that lived on the site contributed to that local community, and that community is the one facing the losses. You know, the school numbers diminishing, staff having to leave jobs, the impact on local community.
How do you feel about this? And do you feel angry or sad or just a mixture of both?
I don't feel any, to be fair. It is a hard situation for anybody.
Yeah. No, well, it really, really is. And thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts with us tonight here on GB News.
Thank you.
As I say, too little thought for the human impact of what we're doing to accommodate those that come illegally across the English Channel. Think of Stradey Park, Deneth and Nethley. 95 people from that little Teneth and Nethley have lost their jobs, been sacked by Clear Springs, the company that is managing that rather lovely hotel for, I think it's 241 people who crossed the English Channel. Not enough talk about the human impact. Now, I love Elon Musk. I really do. He is a disruptor. And he's announced, well, he hasn't announced, but we found out overnight he wants to come in and bust up the UK electricity market for domestic supply. That sounds to me like 3 cheers for Elon Musk's. We'll delve into the details in a couple of moments. This show never goes far away from the vital question of energy and the drive for net zero, and does it work or doesn't it? Clive Moffat, former advisor to the government on energy security, joins me again. Overnight, an announcement. Elon Musk, the great disruptor. I love him. He's bought Twitter. He believes in free speech. Amazing guy. Does the electricity market need disruptors?
We've had a lot of disruption. We've had energy caps, and we've had, at least a dozen major suppliers go bust at cost of billions to UK consumers.
Because we bailed them out.
The point is, do we need another supplier? The last time I looked, I think we had over 30 electricity suppliers on the market. Some 60 have ceased trading for various reasons. Ofgem has presided over the demise of a dozen. As I say, a significant cost because of the energy price cap and the rising cost of gas last year.
Yep.
What can he do in the market that's different? I don't know. He'll still have to, unlike the big six, which have their own generation capacity, and they're integrated businesses, he'll have to be basically relying upon the wholesale market and to buy wholesale and sell retail.
But he says he's got a genius plan. He says he's got something called a Powerwall battery.
Okay.
And the Powerwall battery will take in electricity at night when it's cheap and send it back to the grid during the day. Are we really there yet?
I don't think so. I think batteries. I think batteries in cars are reasonably well advanced, and he obviously knows a great deal about that.
Yeah.
I think batteries in terms of storing power from wind farms.
Yep, which is what he's saying.
Is an issue which hasn't been resolved.
No.
I don't think it's viable at this point in time, and certainly not with the duration you require when the wind's not blowing. But in terms of battery, generally, what you got about 6 hours, maybe, possibly. I'm being told by experts. He'll still have to buy that electricity in the wholesale market to charge. He'll then have to retail it. He'll then have to find out some kind of competitive pricing structure. We don't know whether we're going to have caps or whether they eventually will get rid of the whole cap system. So to some extent, I wish him well. And I think Ofgem, as you know, because of their problems last year, have finally tightened up the conditions that they impose on suppliers who, in terms of financial resources. So I don't think they'll have much problem with that.
Maybe I got overexcited about Elon Musk.
But, I wish him well. I mean, the point is, let's see what happens.
No. And if this battery... I've always said, if wind energy isn't subsidised by the taxpayer, and if we can find a battery storage method that works, fine. They're ugly, but fine. But, but as you say, we're not there yet. Bigger debate. The net zero debate. Suddenly, in Germany, this is becoming a massive issue.
It's become very big in Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, and I think there's a growing concern amongst voters and also people in the market that, in fact, the timescales and the deadlines that have been set are unrealistic. I think we've seen now in the Labour Party that they've had to come back.
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? Because it seemed that Ed Miliband was back in charge of the public discourse of the Labour Party. Big changes there, aren't there?
Yes, and we've had stories of Keith Starmer saying that he hates tree huggers, whatever that means. But I don't think it means it hates Ed Miliband. But the point is that, yes, they've had to come back on that. They're still talking about no new exploration after 2030 for North Sea oil and gas, which I think is a big mistake because we have to reduce imports, and we're going to need them for the next 20 years. They have come back on their $28 billion a year for the next electoral period because they don't think the country can afford it. So we've had some comeback on that, with some turnaround on that. Meanwhile, the government seems to be quite happy to see Labour arguing about this issue, but itself, Number 10 is still maintaining that the targets for 2050 and for 2035 on taking gas out of the electricity system still stand.
And 2030 for no new manufacture of cars that are not electric, which many experts think literally has the car market to China.
Yeah. Those deadlines, I think, have got to be called. I mean, I think they've got to be turned off. I think the deadline for cars, and I think certainly the deadline for heat pumps has got to be taken away because that's simply not viable. I mean, we're still going to be 80% dependent on natural gas for domestic heating. A recent hydrogen experiment has had to be cancelled.
I saw this. Now, residents were very unhappy about hydrogen boilers. And is that fear of explosions? I mean, what was the main fear?
Main fear was explosions and the fact that they weren't prepared to continue to supply natural gas, apparently, even during the trial period.
Really?
So that you had to, so neither it was a binary decision by customers. And I don't think some of them wanted to go down that route. And so I think basically there's a lot of growing concern about the trajectory for net zero and its costs and who pays. And as you know, I've always argued that the government should be taking steps now to underpin energy security before the election.
No, Clive Moffat, I agree with you. And it seems that both government and opposition do not believe in us being self-sufficient in energy, which I find totally and utterly extraordinary. Any prospect for change between now and the next election?
I fear not. I have been working to talk. I've been briefing with MPs and talking about the possibility of changes on the Conservative government stance to draw a line between them and Labour in terms of energy security and net zero. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we could end up going into the election with exactly where we stand at the moment. One interesting thing viewers may well be interested to know is yesterday's decision by Centrica to announce that they'd done a long-term LNG deal with the American supplier to replenish RAF facility, which is the only significant gas storage facility in the country. I think that's in principle a good idea, but only, and this is my one reservation, at what price has that been negotiated? If it's based on market prices, then fine, but if it's based on some kind of premium to American suppliers...
But strategically, a step in the right direction. Clive Moffat, as ever, superb. I've got time for a quick barrage the Farage from Fiona. Fiona, what have you got for me?
Hello, my name's Fiona. I was just wondering, if the EU is meant to be in a recession, how come the value of the euro remains so high?
Well, Fiona, a foreign exchange question. Goodness gracious me. Sterling actually against the dollar is remarkably strong. It's almost 129 trading today. How the euro maintains its relatively strong level is completely and utterly beyond me. But luckily, I have one of the great gurus of modern financial markets sitting next to me. His name is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and he will absolutely have the answer for this.
Well, I think the euro is a construct that actually won't last forever. So
I agree.
I think, like you, it's value.
But she's right. It is
very hard to justify. And if you look at all the Target 2 balances and so on, and the amount of money that they've printed, it's remarkable that the euro has the value that it does. You're right about sterling against the pound. I would expect that I probably shouldn't give financial advice on this programme. Sterling to strengthen further because we look likely to have further interest rate rises. And although we're high over the last couple of years, we're not high over the last 10 years.
No, that's true. Jacob, what do you have for us tonight?
We're going to be talking more about the Huw Edwards story and getting on to the key thing about the freedom of the press. Was it right that the name was withheld for so long? Has the Sun done people a public service by bringing this to our attention? Is this important? Why is the left so anti the freedom of the press and being so sniffy about it? I think these are really important
No, they are,
discussions.
but then we saw the Cliff Richard case and it's,
And it's very difficult.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult, and where do you draw
the
line? We're also going to be talking about critical race theory, and do you know your privilege?
Oh, I know. According to the Archbishop of Canterbury, I certainly am. But before all of that, let's get the weather.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. Stays unsettled over the next few days. We'll have showers on Thursday and then rain spreading in for Friday and turning quite wet and windy as we move into the weekend. Last area of low pressure that we've had the last few days pulls away, and then this area of low pressure moves in to end the week and into the weekend, bringing unsettled conditions for all of us. There's still some showers around to end Wednesday, largely across the north and the west. Overnight, the clearest spells across eastern and southeastern parts of England. Elsewhere, still a mixture of showers. And temperatures generally holding up in double figures tonight, generally 11 to 14 Celsius. So it means a mixed start to Thursday morning. There'll be some sunny spells from the word go, but also a scattering of showers. Thursday, as we go through the day, there'll be lots of sunshine in places, particularly across eastern areas. The cloud will bubble up. We could see some showers, but showers should be fewer and farther between compared to recent days. We could still see a few heavy ones, particularly across Scotland, but lots of places staying dry. And it will just feel a little warmer than recent days as a result. Generally high teens to low 20s. Highs around 24 degrees towards the southeast. Into Friday, it all starts to turn more unsettled. Areas of low pressure begin to move in, so we see cloud and rain sweeping in from the southwest, pushing northeastwards. This turning heavy at times. Best of the dry weather holding on for longest across Scotland. Temperatures near average.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.